Right, well, welcome everybody to our latest drop-in session. So topic today is about process design. It's off the back partly of a number of conversations recently around looking at the difference between mapping as-is processes, so what happens today, and future state or to-be processes. So what does the process look like in tomorrow or in the future? I think we've mentioned this before in some of these sessions that topic is certainly it's one of the most visited pages on our website in terms of an exploration of that topic, and trying to make a decision about when do we just focus on capturing the process that exists today, and when do we look at the future state or to be process. So off the back of a number of those conversations, the question often comes up about, how do we map or design a future state process? And actually, that's a big question. There's a lot to try and unpack in there, and we've got sort of 20 minutes or so. So I'm going to try and dig into a few different areas. But basically, what I want to try and achieve today is just give you some sort of high-level pointers, some tips and tricks, a couple of ideas about different techniques that you might apply depending on the scale of your design or redesign of the process. So I'm just going to walk through some of these concepts at a very high level. First thing I want to start off is just talk a little bit about what I've called it rather flippantly, what makes a perfect process, but we'll just go through some principles around really what makes a good process. And so what are the sorts of things that you might look for in a process, and equally you might use this in terms of what's missing from the process and therefore I should have to improve it, or actually if I'm designing something from scratch, a simple checklist that will help me check what should be in there. A little bit about as is. I'll touch the difference between as is and to be, and how that impacts what you do around designing a process. We'll touch on that. Then I've got some basic principles, so things that to look out for. Things, again, there's some real simple tips and tricks that you can include. And then as the last topic there is, I've called it advanced techniques, but it's maybe just some more perhaps interesting techniques that I've used in my career in process improvement over the years, especially when it's been a maybe more complex or bigger type activity. So let's start off with what makes the perfect process. And as I said, what I'm really talking about here is what makes a good process. What are the sort of characteristics of a process we should be looking for to make sure this is a good process. So I've started here really with kind of one of the most important things that most of us think about and talk about nowadays is thinking about the customer perspective. So, being really, really clear about who is the customer for this process. And when I use the term customer, in this case, I'm going to be talking about both the customer of the organization or the business. So, if you're a commercial business selling a product or a service, the customer that is buying and consuming that product or service. But also think about your internal customer as well. So, you can think about both differently. So many processes will be touching and impacting customers directly, but others might not be. And just as simple examples, again, I'm just going to pick something quickly out of the air, but for example, a human resources stroke people type process actually is really about sort of delivering, making sure we've got the right people with the right skills across the business to do what we do as an organization. So really, really important to be clear about the customer, know who your customer is. But I think the other thing that often doesn't always get thought about in enough depth when I'm looking at processes with teams, and that is, once you understand who your customer is, try to get as clear as possible about what is it that they value. So obviously they are consuming some output from your process. That's great. If you're a recruitment team within a business, then obviously you're trying to fill roles within that team. But what is it that they really value? They're expecting to place a person within a particular role, but what's important to them about it? Is it important that they've got exactly the right skills and competencies when they arrive, or actually is it an issue of speed for them? So how quickly can we get get that person into position? If you're in a type of business where you've got like a high churn rate of staff, speed of getting people into roles might be more important than having the exact skills which you might expect that you're going to train on the job and so on. Or it might be a cost thing, or it could be a number of different requirements. But there is a set of requirements that the customer has in terms of how they understand value, which is really important to understand when you're designing a process, because that will help you start to make decisions about, do we need to reduce the time that this process takes? Because actually, if you're looking for making sure that you get exactly the right person in a role in that recruitment or talent acquisition process, actually you might be prepared to sacrifice the speed it takes to get there in terms to get the right person. So when you're designing the process, building a process that does it really, really fast might not actually be delivering what the customer really wants from that. So again, there's a few things on here. I've talked about the purpose of the process, and I talk about the standards you're measuring against, but it really comes down to who is the customer and what is it that they value about what the process is delivering. Now, to me, all of the other things in here, essentially, they flow from understanding that, and they may impact your ability to deliver that, but there's often a trade-off there that you may have to make. So second point is the process needs to be able to operate within the constraints of the organization. So what are those constraints? It could be everything from regulatory through to cost. Have you got the right people, technology, equipment within the business to be able to do that? Again, if cost is an important piece, it might be that we're going to spend 6 months to find exactly the right person to fill this role, but that might cost so much money that actually doesn't make sense to the business. So again, you need to be able to understand these constraints. And then the last two I've put on here, I've separated them out, but they are quite closely related. So is the process robust? And by that I mean, it's not going to break easily or often. If we put something together, or we're deploying a set, some tools as part of the process, or we don't have the necessary skills to execute the process, it can make it quite flimsy and therefore likely to go wrong. So what are the things we can do to ensure the process is robust? And then the last one in there is it flexible? And I think this is really important because it can it change when it needs to, but is it constantly improving? And that really comes down, I'm going to touch on this in one of the later sections, but that comes down to this first section. So, making sure that we're always clear about who the customer is and what they value, because that may change over time. And so making sure you understand those things, and then you've got a feedback loop to make sure that you're making sure that the process is delivering those things to the customer and within the constraints of the organization. So some basic principles there about, as I said, what essentially makes a good process. I go back. So I talked about do we need an as is, and the difference between an as is and to be process. So I don't want to open up that whole conversation about it, but there are some important things before you start designing your process. There are some things that you need to understand before you dive in. So there's some of those principles we just talked about are obviously important, but whether you need an as is or not might come down to a few different things. So, is this an existing process that's being improved? Right. If you don't have that existing process documented today, our recommendation is very much so that you should go and look at documenting it to some extent. Does it need to be all the detail? Not necessarily. If you're about to change this process with a new design, it doesn't necessarily need all the detail. But what you do need is you need to know enough about what's not working as you want it to today so that you can fix it. There's always a danger in process improvement and process design that you are you're addressing the symptoms of a problem rather than the root cause. It's, you know, you can draw medical analogies to this. Taking painkillers for a pain isn't really fixing the pain. It's just getting you over you know, a particular point in time. But understanding what's causing the pain can then help you fix the root cause. And it's exactly the same with processes. And if you don't have sufficient understanding of that process, it's then too easy to end up trying to solve the symptoms rather than really understanding the pain, the underlying root cause. Mapping the as-is process isn't the silver bullet to that issue, but it will absolutely help you dig into that process and understand it better. And the last point I made underneath there, which is about getting buy-in. So again, you're involving people and you're showing them that you want to understand what's wrong with the process so you can really fix it properly. And often what will happen is people will start talking about symptoms, but as they map the process out, doesn't have to be in lots of detail, they'll start to get to the root cause quite quickly. And there might be some tools you can use to dig into that a bit more, I'll touch on after. So if you're designing a completely new process, then there is no as is, if you like. So there is nothing to go and map today. But all of the things I talked about, which is, okay, really understanding what it is you're trying to achieve and why is the organization not doing this today? Is it a problem in the organization, or is it just something completely new that we're doing? Try and learn, as you know, going back to those principles I just talked about good process. You know, have you got all of those things? Have you understood who the customer is and the value? Do you fully understand what those constraints are of the organization that you've got to operate within? That's a little bit about this sort of, you know, what makes a good process? What should we be looking for in a good process? And then what's the sort of background work we might need to do before we go into designing a process? So the next two sections I've got here, first one is kind of the basic principles, and then, you know, a little bit sort of some other ideas. So in terms of basic principles, you're trying to understand. Again, I've got some sort of basic stuff here, but for those of you who've been through any of our onboarding or training sessions, I'm sure we'll be aware of when we talk about the 5 steps to the perfect process. So there's some key things in here. It's like, okay, do you know who the process owner is? Do you know who the customer is? Do you know what the customer values? Do you know what the start and end point of this process is? Are you aware of some of the roles or resources that might be involved in it? Some of the tools that you already have in the organization that will be available that you may be able to use in it, or it might be that you're looking at other things. But just at the very least, you need to start sketching out what the basic requirements are. Then you can start thinking about things like, okay, I'm not sure if everyone here is familiar with Plan, Do, Check, Act, or PDCA, but it's a really nice, quite simple model for how you think about how you continuously improve a process. Now, there are process improvement techniques that you can apply to parts of an organization or teams or processes to improve them, but there are things you can build into a process to make sure those things are happening as part of doing that process. And so hopefully I can get this across here, but most of what we talk about when we're mapping a process is the do part. It's where we're doing the work that needs to be done. And one of the things that I find is often missing from processes, especially for organizations that are growing very fast or change often, that our processes lack the planning bit. What are the activities we do on a periodic basis to plan how we do or what we do in the do part of our process. So planning activities could be anything from like, what is the volume of activities that are going to go through, or volume of work that are going to go through the process, or how do we qualify some things in and out of that process, because those things change over time. So running regular planning activities early in your process will ensure that you're kind of adapting to those over time. Then the check part of your PDCA or process, again, is something that I too often see that's missing in processes, and that is, what steps have you got in your process to actually monitor what you're doing within the process? So you plan something, you're going to do it. It could be as simple as a step on the process, which is monitor the performance of the activity, but at least you've defined that somebody somewhere, and you're going to put a role against this, so you know that somebody has the responsibility to make sure that they are monitoring the work that's happening. We'll often talk about KPIs and PPIs that we should understand against the process, but we need to make sure that somebody is actually monitoring them. To the extent that we can automate them, that's fantastic, but somebody still has to own that number to make sure that it's being done. And then the last piece of that, again, if possible in a process, for me, putting it in there is good if we can. It might actually exist somewhere else in a different process, but okay, so you've planned your work, you've done the work, you've monitored to make sure that it's doing what you planned to do or not, as the case may be. What is it you're going to do to fix that or change it or improve it in time? And I think, for me, this is one of the probably simplest but most important things to try and think about in terms of when you're putting a process together, is just thinking about these activities and how they fit in. I'm going to use a very simple example of where this works really, really well, and that's in agile software development. And so, depending on what type of agile you might be employing, but if it's the kind of the common sort of Scrum approach, software developers are developing software. So they are writing code to make software applications. But many teams will follow something like an agile Scrum approach, which is based around a sprint. Sprint defines the frequency at which you're going to basically do plan, do, check, act. Often sprints can be 1 week, they can be 2 weeks, they might be a month. It depends on the team and the nature of the work that they're doing. But they start with planning. What are the things we're going to do within this sprint? The doing part, which is writing code for the software, is then done. And then they check it. Did it do what did we do the things that we said we were going to do? If not, why not? And of the things we did, what would we do differently, better, or continue to do the way that we do it? So at the end, they have a check point, or a retrospective, they often call it. And then there's an act piece. Okay, what are we going to do differently next time? So that the process should, when all those activities are followed, works really, really smoothly and continues to be flexible and adapt over time. So the other things I've got in here, again, just sort of to go over them quickly, is I've used this term, know your audience. So obviously what we're talking about here is the modeling or mapping of processes. So we are creating some sort of process documentation. It's important to know who is the audience, so who is going to read this documentation we create. And that may change over time, especially if you're in, say, a change or transformation program. If you're going and doing an as-is piece of work at first, you might be just doing that just so that the project team can understand the issues and challenges and pain points today. So as long as the project team understand it, that's good enough. When you go into the design and implementation phase, the first part of that might be quite technical. You might be designing the process in order to build systems or configure automation. Therefore, the process needs to include the information both that the business can understand, so they can sign it off to say, yes, this is what we want. It will deliver what we want. But it also has to include the information that the technical audiences will need to know in order to configure the system. So things like the requirements and so on. So have in mind when you design this process, who's going to be reading them, and does the process include the information that they need to be able to do that. And then I talked about the measure part in plan, do, check, act. What is it you're going to measure? What are the actual numbers that you're going to measure as part of the process? Again, we recommend, if possible, actually putting that against the process somewhere. So if you're going to measure something at a point in the process, define it against the process so that people know what's being measured. That could be as simple as just capturing it as an attachment against the process. Advanced techniques. The first one in here I've talked about a fair bit already, and really, really important that if you are fixing problems in existing processes, make sure you fully understand the root cause of the problem. One tool that actually I've called out here, very, very simple tool, is called the 5 whys. If you're not familiar with it, definitely worth looking up. Basically, it's about if somebody states a problem, you don't know initially whether it's a symptom or actually a root cause. It's just about asking the question, okay, well, why does that happen? And they'll say, oh, well, it happens because of this thing over here. So you can ask again, okay, well, why does that happen? And you essentially just keep asking why does each thing happen until you can get to the point where it's, what's the root cause. Now, another really important thing, which I haven't really touched on at all, actually, is the second point, which is about having the right experts in the room when you're going through the design. And again, this is very important in technology type projects. It's great to design, to get like the business together and say, what's the perfect process that we'd want to run through? But if the technology that you're using to support that process can't deliver what you want, you've got to make a decision, right? Is it the right technology? Well, it might be too late for that decision. That might be one of the constraints that the organization has placed on your process. You have to work with the technology that's there. Or if you've got infinite flexibility, you might be able to go out and select something that does exactly what you want. The thing that you want to do might not exist as a technology out there, so bear that in mind. But when you're getting to the point of designing the process and you know or have a good idea about what the technology is, having the experts in the room is so important, because they will be able to tell you whether something's possible or not. What's the art of the possible? And one of the dangers of not having them in the room is you've designed this perfect process, and then the technologists try to retrofit your process to the technology they have, which means they can often end up creating ugly workarounds to try and make stuff that they think you want to do, when actually you might be prepared to make sacrifices in the process for other reasons. So having them in the room just kind of shortcuts that and gets those questions answered straight away. I've mentioned compliance in here. It's another thing as well. Again, I've seen it before where we've designed or improved a process, and then the compliance team is going, no, we can't do that because it actually breaks something else in the organization. So if there is a compliance angle, it's worth trying to get somebody in the room who can help you navigate that if it's a potential issue. Last thing I'm just going to finish on here is I've called it think differently here, but again, over my career, I've had a number of projects or teams that I've worked with where they go, do you know what, we just want to rip up the book. We want to tear up what we've already got. We want to do blue sky thinking and really kind of challenge the current thinking in the organization and do something completely different. And so I just wanted to provide a few examples of how you might go about tackling that if that's what you want to do. There's a bit more work to do around this, but it can be really valuable, and I've certainly been involved in some exciting projects that have used some of these tools. So one of the simplest ones here is one that can be quite fun, and it's good if you're improving an as-is process. Is that I've called it the must-do game. But I first read about it in Alex Sharp's workflow modeling book. So a really good book if anyone's interested in, again, learning more about these sorts of topics. So it's called Workflow Modeling Tools for Process Improvement. It's got a little bit about automation, but it's got lots of good stuff about just understanding processes. And in this game, essentially what you do is you take an as-is process and you get someone in the room to read it out and say, we must do each step. You basically go, we must do this, and we must have this output, and we must then do this thing. And what it does is it then forces people to challenge it and go, well, we don't really have to do that thing, do we? And although you're just taking the language that's already there, and by just adding must do, it just gets people to kind of think, well, okay, well, what would happen if we didn't do that thing? And it helps people to challenge what's done today and start to come up with ideas about different ways of doing things. Generates great ideas. Lateral thinking, again, for those of you not familiar with it, I think De Bono was one of the sort of leaders in techniques for lateral thinking. I called out here the Canadian Power Company. I'm going to try and very quickly tell this story because I think it's a really, really interesting one. The whole idea of lateral thinking is to try and get people to think differently about a problem. And the way they approach it is to go, let's kind of leap completely away from where we are now and try and think of something utterly ridiculous as a way to fix this problem. And then in trying to work out how to achieve that solution will help generate ideas for how to actually fix it in real life. And the Canadian Power Company is a good one in that they sat people in a room. The problem they had was, Canada is a massive country, with population distributed, all over it. And when they run overhead power cables across the country to really, really remote communities, and obviously they have very, very harsh winters. And so one of the problems that they have to deal with is ice. So snow falls. Power cables are warm, so when the snow falls on it, it melts, but then it's cold enough that it then freezes. And as over time, you get a buildup of ice on the power cables until it gets so heavy that the cable snaps. And this is out in the middle of nowhere, very, very remote. And the challenge was, how do we solve that problem? What can we do to fix that problem? And they used this lateral thinking exercise, and they came up with a lot of stupid ideas. And one of the stupid ideas was, if we could get, these power cables could run through forests that are full of bears, wild bears. If we could get bears to shake the pylons, it would shake the cables and the snow and the ice would fall off them. So they said, great, let's take that idea and work out how we're going to deliver it. How do we get a bear to shake the pylon? And someone said, well, if we could put honey on the top of the pylon, the bear could smell the honey and they'd want to shake it to get it off. So then the question was, well, how do we get the honey on the top of the pylon? And one of the ideas was, well, what we could do is we could fly a helicopter over the pylon and drop the honey onto it. And at that point, someone in the room said, yeah, but if we flew a helicopter over the cables with the pylons, the downforce of the helicopter would blow all the snow and ice off the cables and fix the problem. And now what they do is they regularly fly helicopters up and down the cables to keep them clean from the snow and ice to solve the problem. So that was a very, very shortened version of that story, but it just gives you about coming up with a completely different mad idea and exploring it to see how it'd work to come up with a new process design. The last one on there, given the time we've got, I'm not going to go into explaining it, but there is a book called The Sprint Book. It's by Google Ventures. They've got a really interesting approach about how to design new products, ideas. Processes fit perfectly into it. They even have a process section in it, and it's just, if you're looking for inspiration, it's worth going and digging out and having a look, because it's got some good ideas about how to come up with ideas, how to score them as a group, and then develop them to test them out. Thank you very much for coming along today, and we shall see you hopefully next week. Thank you very much, and goodbye.